This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Look for the button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is Professor of Jewish and Near East Studies and Film Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She has written extensively on Israeli culture with an emphasis on cinema, including in her recently published book, New Israeli Horror, Local Cinema, Global Genre, that was published in 2024 by Rutgers University Press. Dr. Olga Gershenson, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad. Thank you so much for having me here.
So the book is titled New Israeli Horror, but part of your argument is that there wasn't really an old Israeli horror, and that genre cinema in general is fairly new to Israel. So what constitutes new Israeli horror?
Such a good question. I think that the reason I named it New Israeli Horror and not just Israeli horror. First of all, Israeli horror can be misleading, especially now we're talking with you during, I can't believe it, second, I guess, Iran-Israeli war. So I think the word horror right now resonates very differently with us. I have to tell you that I wrote this book way before even October 7, 2023. So, so the word horror was not as resonant as it is now. However, so you asked me why new. I think I wanted to indicate a certain time in which it appeared. So as I write in the book, before 2010, there was really no such thing as an Israeli horror film. There were several attempts. There was some of the listeners may remember, in 2005, there was this amazing film by Danny Lerner called Frozen Days, Yamim Klim in Hebrew. There were some really, really bizarre attempts in 1970s. One of these films called American Hitchhiker in Israel became actually a cult film. And that's a film that you can realistically, buy on a DVD, should you still have a DVD player. So, but other than that, there was beyond this kind of bizarre attempts that are maybe interesting to look at today if you are, horror head or if you are an academic. There was really nothing.
So why this leap in the 2010s?
So there were several things at work in 2000. So the first thing is that, again, the book is called New Israeli Horror, right? But I may have as well called this book New Horror Films in Israel, because the Israeli horror films are exactly on the same schedule as every other horror films. There were, you can imagine that Israel is not the only country, not the only culture where horror films just were not a thing, right?
So there were other countries that had this horror renaissance in the early 2000s?
Not really renaissance, emergence. Yeah. Right? And so what I'm trying to say is that for a long time, usually in general, if we're studying Israeli things, oftentimes the tendency is just to interpret everything, based on our internal Israeli dynamic, right? In a conversational, Hebrew, Yiddish, you would say, right? All about our pupik. But it's not all about our pupik, because, Israel is subject to the same cultural tendencies as all the other, relatively small kind of culture industries, right? So, okay, fine. So it's part of the global process. What else is happening during 2000s? So first of all, there is some technological changes, right? Before, in Israel and elsewhere, before 2005, people are shooting film really on film stock. Can you imagine what an expensive process it is? Processing, labs, etc. In like late 2000s, people start shooting basically on digital, which also means that you can edit on the computer, right? It makes everything a lot cheaper, just simply a lot cheaper, and a lot fewer people involved. And, film is, unlike poetry, you need a lot of people, a lot of resources. So today, by the way, when I talk to my students about this, they can't believe it that people didn't edit on the computer. They no longer can imagine that. So I have to show them pictures of montage
Even
table.
for us, it's hard to imagine today, isn't it?
Yeah. So they say, okay, fine. Of course they shot on film stock, but surely they edited on the computer. It's hysterical. Anyhow, so I'm dating myself here.
Wait,
Another
so
thing-
the fact that it was now cheaper allowed for less mainstream genres to emerge, and horror was one of them.
It allowed people who wanted to make a kind of film that wasn't necessarily mainstream or, easily publicly funded. And in Israel, as you may know, film is publicly funded. It's kind of European model of funding, not like in the US with Hollywood, etc., right? Even independent film in the US is something else. So, so all these like genres, subgenres that just like didn't exist, but people were interested in, the filmmakers may band together, kind of film guerrilla style, and just like 5 people can make a movie more or less, right? If they agree to work without pay.
So they were inherently more subversive than...
Inherently, well, let's leave the subversive for later for now. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's a different question. So then you ask me like, so people who want to make these films can make these films. And here we come to the people who want to make these films. So in 2000s, we have a new generation of filmmakers, culture makers coming of age, right? Those millennials of various kind of older millennials, younger millennials. This is the first generation in Israel that grows up exposed to multi-channel cable television, right? Which you as a journalist know appears in Israel remarkably late.
In the early 1990s.
1992, 1993, right? They also grow up finally in the era of, VHS, kind of older millennial, or DVD, and later streaming and pirating and torrents, you name it. So this means that this is the first generation really of Israelis who grow up with access to various type of culture, right? Not just what they see on a single channel of Israeli television, again, single channel until like 1992, and whatever is showing up at, Lev or whatever, like whatever Cinemark is called in Israel near you, right? So now they
When did the Cinematheque started?
The Cinematheque started much earlier, but Cinematheques didn't show like genre film then. Cinematheques were high culture institution. They would show like Godard, they would show like art house. But no one would show like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like that's just not, or like Black Christmas, like that was just not a thing.
Well, in the 2000s they would, but that's later.
Right. But what I'm saying is like before multi-channel television, before VHS, you would never see that in Israel. Okay? So, and I actually did a little bit of research using the newspaper archives, and I look at what kind of movies actually played in the 70s and the 80s. And guess what? The only international horror films that even made it to Israel were like, films like The Shining or like The Rosemary's Baby, like giant classic, hits made by real, artists. I mean, again, this is not and there were no like horror comedies or no kind of more like violent or more trashy or whatnot, right? Like there was no like midnight screenings of horror films. There were barely midnight screenings, period. So imagine here are these people, right, who grow up and they're watching, right, on cable, on DVD, on torrents, like American, sci-fi horror thrillers. They watch in the early 2000s, they start watching Korean revenge thrillers. They watch, like Japanese horror. They watch Spanish horror. And their head explodes and they want to make this kind of films. They go to schools like Tel Aviv
The Cradle
Film School, right? Because at that point, there are not that many film schools. Today, Israel actually has a lot of film schools, but back then, not as many. So they go to the Tel Aviv Film School and the film professors or the film instructors, what do they want to teach? They want to teach them a serious drama, right? They want films that deal with, you can guess, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Mizrahi immigration, maybe some other social issues, right? Later religious strife in Israeli society, but like no one wants to make movies about like vampires and zombies and serial killers. It's just not a thing. And so what happens is that these people, these young filmmakers, these young aspiring filmmakers, they band together and they form this film club called Hamorotek. It's a pun. If you speak Hebrew, you probably heard the root hamor, which is donkey. And donkey, why donkey? It's actually what they want to do. They referring to mules, and mules was one of the torrents. So anyway, so what these Hamorotek suggests, it's like that's where the torrents, right, meets Cinematheque, something like that. That's the pun, okay? And they start, watching films like Zombie Flesh Eaters, and you name it. Thrillers, sci-fi horror. And as they're watching and talking about them, they also start kind of trying making student films, right? Very low budget, very guerrilla style. And then they share the films at Hamorotek, and that becomes a bit of a workshop. And that is exactly how in 2010, we end up with the film called Rabies, in Hebrew Kalevet, that is very self-consciously marketed as the first Israeli horror film. This is a very long-winded answer to your question, why
one.
New Israeli horror? Because in many ways, it is these filmmakers, right, who wanted to position themselves as we're the first, we are kind of the pioneers, right? Invoking sometimes the kind of like pioneering spirit that is characteristic of, Israeli history, right? So, and back then we see articles in the newspaper, in Hebrew newspapers, saying like, finally, horror in blue and white, invoking kind of this Zionist vision.
Yeah, the horror films made Aliyah. But
exactly.
I wonder why it didn't happen before. I mean, I get all the structural considerations that you were talking about. And I'm also surprised that Israel, in this sense, was not unique to other smaller cultural markets. But horror films or even sci-fi films. And all these you mentioned the word that I was looking for, trashy, is a good word to use here. Like the less conventional, the less, self-consciously low quality cinema is a very potent vehicle for social and political critique, which is, as you said, was what Israeli cinema was all about before.
That is a wonderful question. I think that you are asking it because you are a kind of sophisticated cultural critic. You just asked me your question based on the assumption that horror is an excellent genre for cultural critique. I agree with you. However, when I speak to people, not like academics and cultural critics, but just like regular people, even very smart people, usually the assumption is that either, I'm not going to watch horror because it's disgusting, or I'm afraid, or whatever. It's like, it's not something for me. And the second assumption is that it's either trashy or it is escapist. So, and that perception of escapist is very pervasive. So yes. So I think this is...
And therefore taboo. I mean, that's why it's considered...
It's not taboo.
No, taboo by the cinematic establishment.
Oh, in Israel, the cinematic establishment just kind of like wrinkled its noses at it, right? It's too trashy. It's too low register. It's not cultured enough. In general, look, I mean, the same thing in Israel, the same kind of attitude was extended to local genres like burekas, for instance, right? Burekas being the kind of ethnic comedies and melodramas that were universally popular. I mean, I'm sure that...
But looked down upon.
That, Salah Shabati is like the paradigmatic burekas is like a classic of Israeli cinema. Guess what? Most of the burekas films in the same, along with Mizrahi music, were just really, really denigrated, were not supported. And in fact, burekas films disappear from Israeli cultural, from film production when the film funding model changes.
Burekas films, just to say, is sort of like popular, perhaps lowbrow comedies that are
phenomenal.
That cut along ethnic fault lines, more or less, right?
Again, there's those comedies and melodramas that usually deal with kind of tensions between, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Israelis, between kind of East and West within the confines of Israel, and sometimes they are tearjerkers, sometimes they are kind of, the kind of silly laughter, right? But ultimately, this is actually the authentic Israeli genre, and today we think they're amazing. But for many, many years, they were really...
some more than others, I have to say.
Some more than others, but...
some of them are pretty bad to this day.
Even, yes, everywhere.
Melodramatic and silly humor.
Right.
And,
but Policeman Azulai...
I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure that I would consider Salah Shabbat and Policeman Azulai burekas films, but still.
Yeah, they are.
They are?
They are.
Okay,
in terms of film scholarship, they are.
Okay,
yes.
Interesting.
So, absolutely.
I'm thinking, about, the confines of the horror genre. And, again, about this late arrival and why, this almost abrupt emergence of it, as you say. I mean, other than a couple of films that were pioneers before, one in the 1980s and another in 2005.
And a few in the 70s.
And a few in the 70s. Was the attempt to do something that is slightly more watered down, like perhaps a psychological thriller, or things that are not about zombies and vampires, but things that still use the same effective mechanism of horror films, but things that are perhaps more quality, quote unquote.
Yeah. So it's tricky. So first of all, horror is a very slippery genre. Like, there is no one clear definition of horror. Horror is like a little bit like pornography, right? Like, you'll know it when you see it. What I mean is that what is horror is often determined by a consensus in a society at the moment. Like, just to give you one example, today we think of Hitchcock's Psycho comes out. In 1960s, it comes out as a psychological thriller film. It is not a horror film. So something like that happens in Israel, like back in 1970s and 80s, you wouldn't necessarily call your film horror because there was not even such a way of saying it in Hebrew, really. So like these films in 1960s and 70s, like the international films that arrived to Israeli screens, they are not really called horror films. Horror films, as you know, in Hebrew is seret ima. So at first they're called like something else. Then they're called seret imim, like film of horrors, I guess, something like that. And little by little, that even expression shapes up, right? Like, what do you call a horror film? So it's very difficult to make a horror film when there is no idea of horror film. Do you know? It's just, yes, but I do write like throughout like 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were a bunch of films that use horror elements, even supernatural horror, but they're not self-consciously horror films. So I call them kind of precursors or films that use some kind of horror elements, and they don't make a splash because they're not self-consciously horror. They're not new Israeli horror, right? They're not a wave, they're not a movement, they're not making a splash. Also, they're pretty bad. That's another thing.
Yeah. Now, the other part of the film title is local cinema, global genre.
Yes.
So much of your analysis is really about the adaptation of this universally conceived film genre to an Israeli reality, or the lack thereof. I mean, this is another thing that is really interesting because, most of the quality cinema in Israel was really about how we take these big themes that, are accepted in cinema around the world and make them palatable and relevant to an Israeli reality. And also, as you said before, many horror films were deliberately and self-consciously escapist. I mean, just averting this movement. So yeah, so the mechanisms that you talk about are subversion, conversion, and aversion. Why don't you take us one by one?
Okay, so I don't want us to get bogged down in all my terminology, but basically, as I was watching these films, right, and again, right, before, I mean, this is crazy, right? Before 2010, there were like no horror films, and then throughout 2010s, there are enough of them for me to write this book. So it's like, really, there is like a wave. There is a movement. It's like self-conscious, right? With filmmakers who know each other, talk to each other, who's really, it's a wave. It's a movement. Okay. So, and I noticed that as I was watching their films, that some, I recognize some of the monsters, right? Oh, here are zombies. Here is serial killer, right? Oh, here are vampires. Here is, you can imagine, right? You everyone knows, I think that, right, what those are. And yet, when I was watching them, I was blown away. It was so original. It was both familiar and original. They were so funny. I have to say that vast majority of so-called new Israeli horror are comedies, even army comedies, which is a very local subgenre. And I started thinking, so, okay, well, why do I love them so much? I mean, I have to tell you, I'm not a horror head. Like, I'm not, aside from like international classics, I'm not really, I don't like blood and gore and don't enjoy this. How come I love Israeli horror so much? And I started thinking that what they do so well there is that they take this kind of familiar tropes, right? Let's just say zombies. And they land it in the middle of Israeli reality. And then we can start thinking, okay, and what happens once they do that? So one of the filmmakers told me, we Hebraize the horror, right? So in Hebrew, le'avret et ha'ima, right? They literally like, in the same way in which you would Hebraize the name, for instance, right?
How did it play out?
Okay, so how did it play out? So, and then there are like several things that happens, right? So the easiest and the most common strategy is like, okay, so you take zombies, right, or whatnot, vampires, and you land them as is into something very, very Israeli, like an idea of base, okay? So one of my favorite movies...
A military base.
Like a military base. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like basis tzvai.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one of my favorite films called Muralim, Poisoned in English. And it's an army comedy, which is very Israeli subgenre, about a zombie eruption, but on an army base. Okay? So now, if you've ever been, not even been to an IDF base, but if you've ever seen like a show or especially a comedy about IDF base, right? Like you can imagine the characters, the commander, a jobnik, a military ace, the whatnot.
All the stereotypes.
Yeah. All the stereotypes. Now, and it is like that, but with zombies. And I noticed that the way the filmmaker makes it work is that he takes this several like kind of zombie scenarios and tropes. In the case of Muralim, Poisoned, that was the wonderful film Shaun of the Dead. Right, which is
zombie classic, yeah.
Right, zombie classic, where a zombie epidemic eruption takes place in kind of like British backwater, and for a while no one even notices, right? And then gradually, kind of character who is really kind of a loser, right? He rises to an occasion. That's exactly what happens in Poisoned. A lowly jobnik, right? A jobnik is a soldier who does not have a commando function, right? He's not the most heroic of them. He like trims the bushes or something. He's like glorified garden on the base. And, he really rises to the occasion, and he defeats all these hordes of zombies who are these like commando troops.
Well, why do you think it worked so well with zombies and it wouldn't just work as well as just a standard military comedy?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. How do we think about zombie? What is like a zombie metaphor, right? Zombie is someone who is kind of dead inside. right? A zombie is someone who just like automaton, right? It just goes through the motion. I'm saying he because it's very masculine, you can imagine. And in a way, like when you see these hordes of zombies in the Israeli military uniforms, all of a sudden it's subversive. All of a sudden it's satire, right? Not only that, but also like even the title Poisoned is also very satirical because poisoned, Mur'al, is both like literally poisoned, right? If you were poisoned by something bad, right? And in the film, these commandos receive a spoiled vaccine of something other, and that's how the pandemic starts. But also, it's a slang for someone who is a real army aficionado.
Yeah,
like,
overly motivated. So,
who is like, yeah. So in a way, even the title already gives us like perspective, right? They're like, well, they're poisoned, but they kind of were poisoned maybe even before they became zombies, right? And in a way, they were also bullies and really mindless even before they became zombies. And that's why the zombie metaphor works so brilliantly for Israeli cultural context. And also, it's like really funny.
So that's one good example of how the zombie trope was adapted to an Israeli reality. Right. But there were other cases that you explore in the book that deliberately had nothing to do with the Israeli reality, which is also interesting in a way because it allows the viewer to literally escape.
So here is the interesting thing. So I actually, before we go into that, I want to talk about one more strategy that I find like extremely interesting, and it's very sophisticated. Right. So we said like this one is just like straight ahead, right? The zombies are zombies. The Israeli context is Israeli context. Everything's good, right? And it's true. Like this is most of the movies. That's exactly what they do. Some films, not that many, do something very sophisticated. They're like, look, we can take like a trope, like a horror trope, like let us say serial killer. Okay. We have many slashes that have serial killer, right? We're familiar with them. And land it in Israeli reality. What will happen? Then these filmmakers say, okay, if we do that, we can't leave that serial killer as this kind of masked, blind force that just goes, that's unbeatable. No. If we have a serial killer in Israel, he's going to do haltura job. You know, haltura job being slang for kind of like half-ass work. So they're like, so that's what Papushada and Keshales, these two brilliant filmmakers say, okay, so let us imagine a serial killer in Israel. He's going to be like a kind of plumber, who comes to your house, doesn't know how to fix the problem, does kind of a haltura, this kind of half-finished job, and leaves. And that's exactly what they do. They're a serial killer in Rabies. Sorry about plot spoiling, but the film is from 2010. Is incompetent. He, in fact, does not kill anyone. But it doesn't matter because the violence continues. And in fact, pretty much like no one, I think, is left alive. Again, sorry about plot spoiling, but it's on you. The film is from 2010. So you can see how this is a different kind of strategy, right? Like much more sophisticated. And it was very difficult and the reason it's so kind of infrequent is because, look, Israeli public was not, as we've discussed, like really, really familiar with horror genre, right? So this is a very postmodern technique, right? Like you need to know the trope, you need to know how the trope works, and then you like deconstruct the trope. Like, this is a whole other level. Now, there were some filmmakers who said, okay, we want to make a horror movie, but we want nothing to do with Israel. We just want to have fun. Like, we don't want to do the same thing, Israeli, Palestinians, kibbutz idea of the whole thing. No, we just want to make a universal horror film. Turns out, it is virtually impossible to make a universal horror film. Because if your film is set nowhere, it kind of lands nowhere, too. So there was this one film about zombie invasion. It is just like impossible.
It was also in English, right?
It was in English, yeah, with like actors who come from all over. But so every like character speaks with a different accent, but it's never explained like why. So it's insane. And like, I don't recommend the film, and I'm not going to mention it because it's just, like there is no point.
So that actually brings me to my next question. I mean, how good were they? I mean, I have to say that except one, I haven't seen any of them. And I try to keep up. I used to be a much bigger film buff than I am today, but I'm still trying to keep up with the cinematic production, both internationally and locally. And I've heard them mentioned, and the names that you discussed sounded familiar, but it didn't strike me as if these films have made a splash beyond the circles of aficionados and
right.
the people who are.
So this is a very interesting question because it's true and it's not true. So another, we talked earlier on, we talked about technological changes, right? Like the digital filming and stuff. So what happens in 2010s and continues happening now is that the modes of distribution and modes of media consumption changes radically, right? Today, you're more likely to watch something, on your phone, on your computer, sometimes on the go, on the iPad, who knows, right? And then you don't have even like, most people, I think, don't even have like a cable television package, let alone like, right? Or, go to like a big premiere in the movie theater, which is a whole other subject. And pandemic put a nail in it. So what are you going to do? You're going to choose, right? What maybe the filmmakers you're following, or maybe subscribe to a streamer that shows something that you like, right? So, which means that the horror films coming out of Israel are no longer dependent on the local market, right? So Israeli film market is very, very strange market because vast majority of films there, local production, Israel actually makes a remarkable amount of films for its size. Vast majority of these films are seen by anywhere between 10 to 40,000 people, which is, you can imagine, especially if we're thinking in terms of the US, is nothing, and nothing. And then only few films make it big and are seen by 600, 500,000 people, something like that. But that's kind of once in a blue moon, right? And those also not necessarily the best films. Those are just films that appeal to a large number of people. So the reason you don't really, you haven't seen these films is because it's true. Most of them were seen in theaters by something between 10 and 50,000 people, which is nothing. However, they reached tremendous amount of people internationally, because these filmmakers were the first filmmakers in Israel to discover the film festival circuit, beyond like Cannes and Venice and Berlinale. What they discovered is that there is an enormous distribution networks specifically geared to genre cinema. There are fantasy, horror, and sci-fi film festivals, some of them enormous. And so the new Israeli horror filmmakers start sending their films to these festivals. And from these festivals, they sell into new markets. And in general, like horror films, very rarely, the horror films that you would see like in a cinema near you, this is like an exception, not a rule, right? Most of them go to so-called straight to digital release. So which means that they're like sold to, Netflix or DVD or like whatever.
So has this success changed in any way the funding structure? All these film boards now seeing, okay, these films that we didn't give second thought to are now making tremendous success internationally. Maybe we can fund one and see, like, give enough money to make a good and solid one.
So again, yes and no, right? So there were several Israeli films that received actual like public funding, right? But most of them didn't, because amazingly, like years ago, like when I was just over 10 years ago, when I was starting this project and I was talking to the filmmakers, they were all uniformly complaining to me how all these, selection boards, the people who in Hebrew, for some reason, they're called lectorim, like lecturers. I don't know. But there's selection board. I don't know why they're called that way. That reviewers, they are reviewers. Thank you. That they're reviewers. So they are conservative in terms of, not politically necessarily, but conservative in terms of the cultural taste. That you can imagine Israel is a small country. Everyone knows everyone, right? So that they predominantly operate kind of in this style in which you would like give funding to your colleagues and friends, and maybe are less inclined to give funding to something radical and experimental, but not experimental that you recognize, like art house experimental, but experimental in terms of, horror.
Who knows where this money is going to go to?
Right, because it doesn't make sense to these people. So there is very much a generational divide. And so what happens is that for a while, actually in 2010s, there are various kind of like smaller pathways for these filmmakers, for these genre filmmakers to apply for grants. But they apply not for major grant, like $1 million shekel. They apply for various like post-production grant, like which is like 50,000.
But has any of that changed thanks to the success?
So for a while changed. Now I'm not so sure. Right now it's and then again like post. We're talking to you with you again, like 2026, right? The war is raging, several wars. It's like one war inside another war inside another war.
It's hard to keep up, yeah.
It's hard to keep up. We have in Israel, the government is very right-wing. The cultural politics are conservative and right-wing and very kind of protective.
There's also a clampdown on independent culture making in general.
Right. There is, correct. So there is general kind of spirit of censorship and overview, and there is a reform of how the films are funded. And that. So anyway, so right now I can't even comment on that because this is just beyond the core. It's like, and now also it's like a Wild West, Wild East, I suppose, in some ways. Because I don't understand exactly what's happening. Yeah. Right.
But for a recent,
let us talk. So let us stay within like 2010s. Because this was like before, like Israel like exploded, literally, metaphorically, right, in like 2020s. So yeah, it changed and it didn't change. So several films succeed to go and win like major competitions. More likely, the filmmakers just decide that, so each project you can only submit it 3 times, right? And then you're like out. So that means 3 years. If you are a young filmmaker who wants to get going, to wait 3 years and with a very, very like small chance of getting the full grant is not a good idea. You want to get out there, you want to establish yourself, you just want to get going. So actually these filmmakers really find ways to make films independently. So they do apply for public funding, but they're oftentimes kind of alternative frameworks, right? They get like pre-production, post-production fund, and in fact, and working like guerrilla style, they succeed to like fund almost the entire film with these peanuts, So, but most of them work with like micro budgets or no budgets, or sometimes there is a little bit of co-production money. Sometimes there is a little money from television. Sometimes there's just like cobbled together, God knows what. Sometimes it's like student film funding. It's a hodgepodge of things. And that's how this is done.
Yeah. And for a real recitation and analysis of that, as well as the artistic aspects of it that we didn't really go too much into, there's Olga Gershenson's book, New Israeli Horror. Olga, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And watch the movies.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. And most important, join us next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.